coming in, please join us. Come on in. And we are being live streamed as well, folks. That's a reminder to me more than to you. Yeah, somebody got that. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Carol Mason, the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And on behalf of the entire John Jay community, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our Safe and Just Community Summit, which is the first one we've been able to host. And we have wonderful co-presenters with us. Our co-partner, presenting partner is the National Urban League, and you will hear from them very shortly. And we are so honored that they chose us to be their partner for this conference, our first since COVID. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us over the next 2 days and for your commitment to transforming public safety. I am very encouraged to see so many of our partners, civic leaders, government leaders, practitioners, advocates, justice-impacted people, as well as our students and faculty here today. During my first 3 years as president, we gathered at John Jay for the Smart on Crime Conference to discuss key research and promising innovations related to all aspects of crime and safety, from prison reform to gun violence to prosecutor-public defender collaborations. In the years since our last Smart on Crime conference in person, we continued them online during COVID, but since that last in-person conference, COVID-19 has upended our lives and our communities, including the essential relationships, programs, and services that so many rely on for security and stability. The police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many other Black and brown people inspired some of the largest protests in our country's history, in our world's history, calling for a reimagining of not just policing, but all social, economic, and political systems that marginalize people of color in this country. In some communities across the nation, rates of violence and crime surged following the years of significant, very significant decline. At the same time, police departments have faced a growing number of vacancies due to higher rates of retirement and fewer applicants, as well as challenges with morale within their departments. And many communities became embroiled in heated debates about what was driving the challenges to public safety, with some blaming criminal justice reform, while others cited pandemic disruptions of daily life, including connections to friends and family, as well as government services and programs, and community services and programs. In response to the social upheaval around public safety and racial equity that followed George Floyd's murder, John Jay partnered with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives to convene elected officials, advocates, researchers, and law enforcement leaders across the country to have a dialogue across differences and help us identify a path forward. Out of these public convenings came John Jay's Future of Public Safety report, which outlined the path forward, creating, sustaining safe communities. The consensus that emerged from these convenings was that public safety requires investment in community leadership and more funding for essential services that we know reduce crime, such as education, employment, and housing. Today's summit, which we are proud to be hosting with the National Urban League, is the natural outgrowth of our Future of Public Safety initiative. It continues John Jay's tradition of bringing diverse stakeholders together to have a dialogue that is grounded in facts, research, and lived experiences in communities. In addition, as an institution of higher learning, this summit is also central to our mission for educating and preparing the next generation of public safety leaders, including community leaders, law enforcement, and social service professionals. They're all part of creating safe communities. Ultimately, our goal is to find ways to work together. The operative word is together, and move forward to a future where all communities are safe communities. The Safe and Just Community Summit is designed to provide concrete strategies for supporting 4 core characteristics of a safe community. A community that is resourced, just, healthy, and restored. Because of the wide range of change makers and thought leaders present here today, we invite you to engage with the expert panelists and with each other. We've got lots of breakout sessions designed for you all to make these connections. We'll hope you use the time not just to share ideas, but to build relationships and ultimately come away with additional tools to create safer and more equitable communities. They can exist together. Before I turn it over to the President and CEO of the National Urban League, who's been a partner of mine before I got to this job and for the past 6 years, I'd like to acknowledge our partners and supporters who made the summit possible. We are deeply grateful to Arnold Ventures. I saw Jeremy in the audience, who's also my predecessor here. He spent 13 years leading John Jay and then passed the baton. And I'd also like to thank the Public Welfare Foundation, Candace Jones is somewhere in here, for your generous support in making this conference possible. And as I mentioned, I want to give a special thanks to President Jeremy Chavez, who's now the Executive President of Arnold Ventures, for his longstanding commitment to John Jay and leadership on public safety reform. You'll see his conference room across the hall. A special thank you again to Candace Jones, the president of the Public Welfare Foundation, for her contributions to this conference, not just in financial resources, but her thought leadership. She's amazing if you haven't met her. In addition, we greatly appreciate the support Microsoft provided. We also appreciate the contributions from the new press, including sponsoring the book talk that will round out today's plenary session and lunch service, and to the Vera Institute, especially to Ed Chung and Daniela Gilbert. Thank you for your thought partnership and serving as panel moderators, and to Nick Turner, who leads the Vera Institute. This event would not be possible if not for the hard work of the fabulous John Jay team, including Rebecca Atkinson, the Director of Partnerships and Programs for John Jay's Future of Public Safety, our Head of External Affairs, Mindy Bockstein, our facilities and theater teams, and our student interns, who are going to be our future leaders. So finally, I'd like to thank our partners who had the vision for us to do this together. Marc Morial and his team, Jerica Richardson, and the rest of the folks at the Urban League, as well as Simone Jones-Tyner, the event producer, yes, we have an event producer, for her extraordinary partnership in organizing today's summit. So now, it's my honor to introduce the wonderful Marc Morial, the president and CEO for the past 20 years of the National Urban League, to the stage for an important conversation that he will have with U.S. Representative and House Democratic leader, and we hope soon to be Speaker of the House, Hakeem Jeffries, about the work he's doing to promote public safety across the nation.
Good morning. I want to thank each of you for joining us this morning, and let's give President Carol Mason another round of applause for her leadership and work. I am Marc Morial, proud to lead the National Urban League, one of the nation's historic civil rights and urban advocacy organizations. Founded in this city, we operate in over 300 communities across the nation through a network of 92 affiliates. We work on behalf of a range of issues related to civil rights and social justice and economic opportunity. Today, we've come together with John Jay and Vera and others to further an important discussion in America. That discussion is a discussion about safety and justice. Without justice, there's no safety. Without safety, our communities cannot be just. And today, we are going to work to think about new ways to pursue the aim: safe communities, communities with a quality of life, communities that have good jobs, that pay fair wages and decent housing. We see these issues in toto and in totality. We wake up every day, not only here in New York, but across the nation, to an America where there have been 199 mass killings already this year. An America where last year there were almost 50,000 gun deaths, homicides, suicides, mass killings, police violence, violence in neighborhoods. 50,000, if it doesn't outrage you, if it doesn't strike you as wrong, that's 50,000 fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, granddaughters and grandsons, loved ones of somebody who've lost their life This is not a conversation about statistics. This is a conversation about people. Killings at banks, schools, shopping centers, Sweet 16 parties. And now we see a young man who, in his own vision, wanted to be like his idol Michael Jackson, strangled on the subway here in New York. An act of injustice that should be investigated and prosecuted. This morning, while we reel from all of this, and while we reel from the recovery of COVID, we want to have a constructive conversation with elected officials and experts, with activists and scholars, with mayors and members of Congress, and people from law enforcement, about how we strike this important nexus between safety and justice in America. All over the nation, there are new ideas and progressive thoughts flowering from local communities. All across the nation, when I travel, people are crying out for new ways and new solutions for the very same aim. We come not to get caught in philosophical, oratorical rhetoric. We come because we want to discuss real solutions that impact real people in communities all across the nation. So I am thankful, once again, to President Carol Mason and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, to the Vera Institute of Justice, to Arnold Ventures and Microsoft, and give them all a hand for contributing to the success of today. And I want to thank my own team at the National Urban League, our new equitable justice team led by Jerica Richardson, who have worked to curate, along with John Jay, this discussion, as well as our 21 pillars plan for policing and safety, and also who've worked assiduously on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill, worked on a range of very, very important issues. We cannot give in and we cannot give up in this quest for safe and just communities. So it's my pleasure to start this morning's plenary with a conversation with someone who is making waves and will make greater waves. He's a pioneer. He's a Brooklynite. He's a New Yorker. He knows the Q train. He knows all the subways in New York. I won't ask him if he's a Mets or a Yankees fan. I'm confident he's a Knicks fan. So, ladies and gentlemen, he is a brilliant lawyer. He is a pioneer as the first black person in American history to lead a caucus, a party caucus in the Congress. He is the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives, a good friend, a longtime collaborator on many important issues. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm round of applause this morning for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Congressman Jeffries, let's get things out of the way first. Can the Knicks make it?
Absolutely.
All right, give it up for the Knicks. Gun violence, and I want to thank you for being here, has really risen dramatically across the nation over the last few years. And give us a sense of the state of affairs as it relates to gun violence, and the opportunities that may be there or the barriers that may be there to try to move federal policy on this.
Well, good morning, everyone. Mark, thank you for your continued leadership, friendship, partnership, and convening this conference along with Dr. Mason and Nick Turner and the Vera Institute of Justice, all of the partners. It's an honor to be here. I think in the gun violence space, there are real challenges and some opportunities. I mean, I think the challenges are that you've got, an extreme right-wing group of people who are determined to put guns over children, guns over people, guns over lives in an extraordinary fashion. In a country now where we have about 320 million people, there's some estimates that say there are more than 450 million guns circulating throughout America. And unfortunately, law enforcement can't tell you where many of those guns are because of barriers that have been erected. Now, in terms of opportunity, in the last Congress, led by President Biden, we were able to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that did do a few important things. One, it was the first time in 30 years when we were able to break the back of the NRA and pass gun safety legislation. So that was an important first step. Not the only step, but an important first step toward achieving some things. And that legislation included about $250 million in grant money for communities across the country for violence interruption programs that we know work. It included about $1 billion in assistance to deal with mental health challenges that have only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps most importantly, for urban communities, it made gun trafficking and straw purchasing a federal crime for the first time in American history, which is hard to believe that it took until 2022 for that to be the case, because we know guns are illegally trafficked all across the country into communities like those I represent, or the south side of Chicago, or South Los Angeles, Southeast Washington, D.C., states and jurisdictions that have tough gun safety measures, but are flooded with guns from other jurisdictions that do not. And so we think that making gun trafficking a federal crime will allow the Department of Justice, the FBI, the ATF, to do some interdiction in ways that will be more robust. But clearly, much more needs to happen. And House Democrats, we're committed, as we did in the last Congress, to pass universal criminal background check legislation. It is bipartisan, although unclear whether Republicans will allow the bill to come to the floor for a vote. And we believe that weapons of war have no place in a civilized society.
Amen.
And we're supportive of an assault weapons ban.
So you've referenced, I think, the Iron Pipeline, which is this up I-95, sometimes referenced, where guns are flowing from states where purchases are easy and highly permissive. And the legislation creates some opportunities. What executive action do the federal departments, the agencies within the Department of Justice need to do to make that law more than paper?
Well, exactly as you indicated, it's going to be important now that we've given the administration the tools to proactively go after gun trafficking, that we will begin to see law enforcement activity directed at the gun traffickers and some prosecutions that will hopefully lead to a greater degree of deterrence and stopping the flow of guns into communities. And what's interesting, as you referenced, Mark, in New York, the overwhelming majority of guns used to commit crimes in New York City are guns that weren't manufactured in New York City or New York State, or even initially purchased in New York City or New York State. They come from states up the I-95 pipeline, states like Georgia or Florida, the Carolinas, and until most recently Virginia, but Virginia has changed its laws, and that slowed down the flow of guns from Virginia, proving that things can work when there's enlightened gun safety. And the same thing in Chicago, for instance. The majority of crimes that are committed in Chicago related to gun violence, those guns don't come from Chicago or even Illinois. They come from the neighboring states of Indiana, or Iowa, to some degree, Wisconsin. Same thing in Los Angeles. The majority of guns used to commit crimes in places like South LA, as it's now referred to, it's South Central, y'all. But you rename to gentrify. And so we know what happens with that approach. But those guns aren't used, those guns aren't from California. Those guns are from the neighboring states of Arizona, or in some cases, Nevada. And so that's why this type of executive enforcement action will eventually make a difference when it's fully implemented.
What you're also, I think, emphasizing is the limitations of state law. That a state like New York, I just noticed that Washington State can in fact pass strict, stringent gun safety laws, but they're limited because of interstate movement of guns and the iron pipeline. So great to hear you speak about that. I want to turn to policing, which is an important issue. You and I worked, you certainly led an effort with Karen Bass and many others to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill. You passed it through the House twice, I believe, and it got stalled in negotiations in the Senate. What's the prospect in this environment for federal legislation on policing reform or components of it?
Well, this is a continuing challenge, as we've seen in the Tyree Nichols case, amongst others, have illustrated the challenges that remain in terms of police use of excessive force. We were able to, in the aftermath of the tragic killings, murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, move the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act through the House, as you mentioned, working in partnership with you, led by then Congresswoman, now Mayor Karen Bass. And it was the most forward-looking, comprehensive, progressive police reform bill ever to pass any House in the United States Congress. And we're proud to have been able to move that bill, and moved it with a small amount of bipartisan support, but unfortunately couldn't move it through the Senate. Now we face temporary challenges in the House of Representatives in terms of who holds the gavels for the moment. And as a result, I think anything in the police reform space will initially have to emerge from the Senate. And that effort's being led by Senator Cory Booker, working in close partnership with the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Stephen Horsford. And they're doing a great job trying to see if common ground can be found, perhaps on the other side of the aisle, taking steps toward comprehensive police reform, but beginning with the issues that we know some in law enforcement and some state legislative bodies, including here in New York, have been able to move with bipartisan support, such as prohibiting and outlawing the use of the chokehold or any type of strangulation technique that we saw to tragic effect here in New York City, the death of Eric Garner, used in other instances, and of course, in the context of George Floyd's death. We also want to limit or prohibit the use of no-knock warrants, which are inherently dangerous. It resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor. It's dangerous for citizens. It's also dangerous for the police who are executing them. And it needs to be constrained. And there's some support on the other side of the aisle or within law enforcement for doing just that. We also think that there should be a duty for officers to intervene when excessive force is being used. And had that happened, Tyree Nichols would probably be alive today.
George Floyd.
George Floyd, alive today. Eric Garner, alive today. You can go through case after case after case. So we think that those three pillars could be a building block. We want to do more, but those three pillars, responsive to some of the tragic cases that we've seen, can be building blocks for police.
What's your
reform.
sense of public opinion on this issue? I know when we were working on George Floyd, last year and the year before. The polling, when you took the provisions of the bill and asked the American people whether they supported it, no-knock warrants, duty to intervene, they polled in the mid-60s. I mean, there was broad-based support. What's your sense of public opinion, and does it matter with those who may be recalcitrant?
Yeah, I mean, the reactionary types who claim to be about law and order, I'm talking about elected officials who claim to be about law and order, but really continue to support lawlessness and disorder, including the violent insurrection. That reactionary group is always going to be opposed for political reasons, to try to weaponize the issue for electoral purposes. But the American people, as you indicated, Mark, when you break down the specific provisions of George Floyd or other police reform efforts, have consistently remained to be supportive of the notion that there should be fairness, there should be balance, there should be justice. No one should lose their lives at the hands of an individual who was sworn to protect and serve. I think the American people recognize, and certainly it's been my experience in Brooklyn, that the overwhelming majority of police officers that I interact with, many of whom now in New York City are people of color, are hardworking individuals who are there to protect and serve. But we also can't ignore the fact that there are individuals who are engaging in the use of police violence and excessive force. And the American people understand that those individuals should be held accountable for breaking the law. And I think we'll have to do a better job in communicating. Accountability, that's right, should be held accountable for breaking the law. The American people fundamentally do believe in the principle that no one is above the law, and that when someone breaks the law, there should be consequences in a just and in a fair and in an orderly society.
You know, when I led New Orleans and we worked very successfully on police reform, the first thing we did was put a new accountability program in place. Ended up firing almost 10% of the department and cleaning house. But the important thing about it is you learn about the 80-20 rule. We had 20% of police officers producing 80% of the complaints and 80% of the lawsuits. And 80% of the officers produced very little in terms of complaints. And so one of the issues, and this, may be beyond federal purview, but I'd like your thoughts on it, and maybe it's within, and that is the hiring process. And the hiring process, part of George Floyd, would create a registry which would prevent hopscotching and musical chairs, meaning an officer getting terminated from a department in New Jersey and then going to Iowa and becoming a sheriff in some county because they could shield their background or shield their problems. Is there a sense of support for something of that sort? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is one of the pieces of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that I think can also be a building block for work that can be done, even in divided government, based on the establishment of a database that does track officers who have been proven to have engaged in misconduct or police abuse, the excessive use of force, and there should be visibility for departments all across the country in making hiring decisions for the good of the citizenry that those police departments represent. Justice Brandeis once said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sometimes I quote Biggie, sometimes I quote Supreme Court Justice.
Yes, sir.
But sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that certainly applies in this particular context. Had there been a national database available that the Cleveland Police Department could have used, Tamir Rice would be alive today, because that was an officer who killed him, who had been found to have engaged in police abuse in a smaller department but that information was shielded from the police department in Cleveland. They hired that officer, and he killed Tamir Rice.
Yes, yes, absolutely. In that regard, I want to talk about these specialty units and Red Dogs in Atlanta, Scorpion Unit in Memphis, these aggressive anti-crime efforts, and I just get your perspective, because these efforts, which there's always a reaction to violence, and then there's a counter-reaction, because these units tend to be overzealous. They're sort of, with a wink and a nod, given some green light to make stops without probable cause, to engage in aggressive and overzealous tactics. And this is an issue, big issue in the Tyree Nichols case, but it's been an issue here in this city and with law enforcement across the nation. So this is a question really about how to frame the conversation, because you may have some people who think, well, it's necessary because, and then many of us will say, no, but it's unjust, and it's wrong, and it's not going to be effective. How do you frame the conversation about this kind of policing?
Yeah, it certainly is important to focus on both the root cause of criminal activity and make sure that there's opportunity in every single zip code. Frederick Douglass says, it is easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. And certainly, so we should start by creating economic opportunity, real opportunity in every single zip code, constructive opportunities for our young people who don't then get dragged into unproductive activities. Even in that context, we know it's still a small amount of individuals who are the largest drivers of criminal activity. And so blanket efforts in terms of stop and frisk and things of that nature, where you effectively criminalize everyone in a neighborhood, that's wrong, it's unjust, and it's also ineffective. Now, in the context of units like the so-called Scorpion unit, and here in New York City, we've experienced different iterations of this. Amadou Diallo, 41 shots, that was from the street crime unit at the time. And they had a saying, we own the night. Now, how about you own justice? Not we own the night. That tells you the mentality of that street crime unit. It was subsequently disbanded, but we've seen this in iteration after iteration after iteration all across the country, and it's regularly proven to result in tragedy. And I think the vision should be, and this was part of our theory of the case in terms of police reform that we collectively worked on with you and with the other civil rights groups, is that we want to establish a relationship between the police and the community that's not anchored in a warrior mentality, but in a guardian mentality. Because if you have a warrior mentality, street crime unit, we own the night, Scorpion unit, various other names that we've seen all across the country, then you tend to view everyone in the community as an enemy combatant. And if you view everyone in the community as a threat, as an enemy combatant, that's when tragedy happens. That's when Amadou Diallo happens. That's when Sean Bell happens. But if you have this guardian mentality, it's a relationship, it's a partnership with the community where you're there to promote safety for everyone.
You framed it well. Let's give the leader a big round of applause. It's a very important framing. I want to make sure we get to this because your parents were social workers and substance abuse counselors, and our parents always shape our thinking and shape our values. Let's talk about, it's called alternatives. I say it's central to safety. What's your thinking in the American Rescue Plan and in a number of these new pieces of legislation? Cities and counties and school districts are receiving more funds to respond to COVID, but Talk a little bit about your thinking and what you can do to elevate, enhance, and educate people about alternatives to what I call traditional law enforcement, which is sort of an arrest mentality, arrest and prosecute mentality, more on the prevention and community building side.
Yeah, so several ways that we think we can approach this. Stephen Horsford, in the last Congress, along with the Congressional Black Caucus, Urban League, civil rights groups, Reverend Sharp, the National Action Network, we introduced something called Break the Cycle of Violence. So it's a legislative effort to allocate $5 billion. We actually got it through the House, but challenges in the Senate. That's a continuing theme, y'all. Got it through the House in the last Congress, but it would invest in community-based violence interruption initiatives, both in terms of making sure that there were opportunities after school, academic enrichment, summer youth employment, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, arts education, music, opportunities for young people in every zip code, including the most traditionally under-resourced, consistent again with that theory that had been so well articulated by the great Frederick Douglass about intervening early and creating opportunity, but also, to your point, creating a holistic engagement, social workers, substance abuse counselors, people who could de-escalate domestic violence situations in partnership with law enforcement as a complement. And many within the law enforcement community have recognized that they're being asked to address the whole host of societal challenges that they are not trained to address. That social workers and substance abuse counselors and people who can deal with potential domestic violence situations can de-escalate in a way that doesn't involve law enforcement and often yield to an outcome that doesn't result in a violent confrontation. That's something that we can come together on, and we hope to advance.
Well, Leader Jeffries, I'm being told, not that time is up, but that we're over time. But I do want to say thank you enormously for being here. We're proud of your leadership, and we all look forward to working more closely with you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Leader Jeffries a round of applause and thank him. And we are going to be with you in every way and in every respect. So thanks for being here. We know your time is busy. Your staff is giving you the hook. They're giving me the hook. But we could go on, couldn't we? We could go on, but we'll have to do this again. Thank you.
Thank
Hakeem
you, and
Jeffries.
go next tonight.
Let's again thank Leader Jeffries for those great remarks, for his leadership and for his work. And ladies and gentlemen, I am being told that we are now going to take a 15-minute break. And I want you to know it's not a 16-minute break. It's a 15-minute break. And you want to be back because Nick Turner's up next with the Vera Institute of Justice and a dynamic panel. So take 15, not 16. I'll see you shortly.
Good morning. I can't see anything other than about 5 of you are looking at your phones. And I can point out who you are. My name is Nicholas Turner. I'm the president and director of the Vera Institute of Justice. I'm very happy to be here. The pleasure is really all mine to be able to moderate today's conversation, the national landscape on public safety. We're honored to have with us here a very distinguished group of people who are working tirelessly, truly tirelessly, to improve safety and justice across the country. And I'm going to begin with a few remarks, although I've been at pains trying to think of, if I have quotes from Frederick Douglass or Biggie or Justice Brandeis. None of them came to me, so I'm not going to be nearly as interesting as our hopeful soon-to-be speaker. So, listen, we are at a critical moment here in America with the conversation around public safety. I think of this as a moment that is really packed with meaning and significance. And there are four themes that occur to me that we're going to discuss today. One is that the status quo isn't working. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this before we get started. We know that the status quo isn't working. Two, we know that violent crime is higher now and has been higher in the past few years than many of us around the country have experienced in decades, and that causes a lot of anxiety and stress and trauma. Three, there's a sense that we have, at least I believe we do in this room, but I think that we have it nationally, that a comprehensive approach to delivering public safety is needed, and that law enforcement, as much as we've been told over the course of our years, is not sufficient to deliver public safety in and of its own. And then finally, we have an understanding of the need to center and attend to voices of people who are impacted. So let me just unpack those a little bit. The first is we know that the status quo isn't working. So-called tough-on-crime policies have devastated families, gutted communities, and reinforced racist outcomes. For the criminal legal system to truly deliver safety and justice, we have to listen to the data, and we have to embrace new strategies, because what we have, as I said, isn't working. If it was working, we'd be the safest country in the world. One of the most pressing issues, this is issue number 2, is that around public safety is violent crime. And so despite, as I mentioned, a decrease overall in crime rates and being at the tail end of decades of dramatically reducing crime in this country, some places have seen increases in violent crime, particularly in homicides. And it's critical that we understand the root causes of this trend and identify effective solutions that can reduce the harm that's caused and can reduce the violence. But we also have to address the trauma and the grief that's experienced by families and communities who are affected by violent crime, and work towards healing and restoration. Issue number 3, public safety is not just a law enforcement issue. It's something that's deeply entwined with issues such as poverty and mental health, addiction, and systemic racism. To effectively address violence and to create safety, we must take, what I said a moment ago, a comprehensive approach. That means involving multiple stakeholders and multiple sectors. That means investing in programs that provide people with the resources and the support that they need to succeed, such as affordable housing, mental health care, and access to living wages. It also means engaging communities in developing and implementing public safety strategies that are grounded in equity and restorative justice. And finally, as we discuss the national landscape on crime and public safety, it's crucial that we center the voices and experiences of those who have been most impacted by the criminal legal system. This includes survivors of violence and individuals who have been incarcerated and directly impacted by mass incarceration and over-criminalization, and communities that have historically been marginalized and over-policed. Only by working together, all of us, with these communities, can we create a truly just and safe society for all. So I hope that today's conversation will inspire all of us to think creatively and collaboratively about how we can work together to build safer, more just, and more resilient communities across the country. So thank you for joining us, and it's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. So first up is Aswad Thomas, who is the Vice President of the Alliance of Safety and Justice and the National Director of their flagship program. Come on out, Aswad. Of their project, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Aswad is a surviving victim of violence and has become one of the nation's leading policy experts on gun violence, criminal legal system reform, and a leader in building coalitions across racial lines to advance safety. Soon to join him, to his left, is Ben Horwitz. Ben is the co-founder. Ben was trying to walk at a pace so I could get my paragraph out about him, but come on and sit down, Ben. Is the co-founder of Datalytics, which is a nationally recognized expert in data-driven policy management and criminal justice data systems. Ben's work has been instrumental in analyzing organizational problems, evaluating possible solutions, and building data-driven organizations. Soon to join Ben to his left is Patrice Sulton, who is Executive Director of the DC Justice Lab, an innovative nonprofit that is driving a conversation about what constitutes public safety and reimagining public systems that ensure safety and justice for all. Patrice has served on a variety of commissions alongside grassroots organizations in underestimated communities of color that are deeply impacted by over-policing, over-sentencing, and notoriously unsafe jails. And then finally, Syrita Steib. Syrita is the founder, president, and CEO of Operation Restoration, a New Orleans-based nonprofit that works to support women and girls impacted by incarceration to recognize their full potential, restore their lives, and discover new possibilities. Syrita is also recognized nationally for her policy work that dismantles the criminal legal system and removes barriers for women. So a big round of applause to our fantastic panel. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take my seat over here, but what I thought I would ask each of our panelists to do before we get into the meat of things, so I want to make sure that you all have a chance to get to know them a little bit, is to just speak for 45 seconds or a minute to say a little bit about who they are and what brings them to this work. So Aswad, may I start with you?
Thanks, Nick. Once again, I'm Aswad Thomas, the Vice President of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, also the National Director of our flagship program, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. I got into this work as a victim of gun violence. Those 2 bullets ended my basketball career and nearly my life. And like so many crime victims across the country, never received any services or support. And so those experiences led me to organizing survivors across the country to ensure that our voices are at the center of public safety policy.
Once again, my name is Ben Horwitz, and thank you very much for having me here today. I have a background from Carnegie Mellon in data analysis and public policy. So while data is really something I'm interested in and I enjoy doing, I come to the public safety space because I had the opportunity to be one of the reform consent decree implementation managers at the New Orleans Police Department. I had an opportunity to work firsthand within the department to try to bring about reform and change, and then I've had the opportunity to, since then, with Datalytics, try to deliver that type of work and other type of work around data transparency and analysis into our system to try to help create improved data-informed decisions.
I'm Patrice. I'm in Washington, D.C. I started my career doing criminal defense and civil rights litigation there and stepped out of my practice to help D.C. rewrite its criminal code and started DC Justice Lab a few years ago with my law students to change policing, prosecution, and punishment in the district.
Hi, my name is Syrita Steib. I am based in New Orleans. What brought me to the work is my intimate acquaintance with incarceration. I went to prison at the age of 19 and was released at 29. The organization basically started out of necessity. When I was released from prison, they were not talking about the issues of women who had been incarcerated, nor were there any services available. I've since graduated into talking about it as post-incarceration mitigation work, because a lot of times what we are doing is working against the harm that incarceration causes.
Thank you all. So remember, we're talking about reimagining public safety here, and as President Carol Mason said at the outset, what we imagine is a resourced, just, healthy, and restored community. I'd like, if we could, Patrice, can I start with you? You know, in this work to reimagine public safety, we're required to not just live in the present, but to learn from past organizing and civil rights work. Can you speak to a little bit to the lessons that we should learn from these movements?
Sure. This movement is different than other movements in a few important ways. It's important to remind ourselves that we're not organizing laborers for better working conditions. We're not organizing tenants for better housing. We are asking people to roll up their sleeves and help us fix or dismantle systems that they have every reason to want to distance themselves from and forget about altogether. And on the other side of that, there is no promise of a job or a home the way there is in other organizing. On the other side of that is more work, the work of building those structures that actually keep people safe, and the challenge of doing that in a country that is capitalist by choice and anti-Black by design. And so it's more difficult in that way. But there are a lot of lessons that we can draw from the victories that were won in civil rights through litigation and legislation 60 and 70 years ago. And two that I'll share are that social movements are cyclical, and we have to learn to weather the backlash that comes after victories like that. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later. And the second is that, you know, we can only go so far if we're leaving certain people behind. And I think if we really embrace that and understand how harmful it can be to engage in the kind of line drawing that we see in movement work, we would do well to not categorize people based on offense type or categorize people based on age, but to really take a broader and more intentional approach about being inclusive of everyone that we want to move forward together.
Patrice, can I ask you a follow-up question? I mean, this is hard work, and it's different, and you described it as such. And what we ask of people to do in this work, we ask of people to re-engage with trauma that they've experienced, to not only dismantle systems, but to try to imagine and to push for the creation of new systems and structures in a way that often defies sort of the public imagination. How do you, I mean, sort of taking from your, you know, what you know of movements of the past, where do you find your energy and your motivation when you are feeling the fatigue of this difficult work? Where do you get your inspiration?
DC is an interesting place to reimagine because unlike any other state, we have a really interesting socioeconomic demographics. We don't have any poor white people in the District of Columbia. And so unlike other places where it might be difficult for people to imagine what does it look like to abolish police or to abolish prisons, we've already abolished police and prisons for white people who live in Washington, D.C. We don't use police or prisons at all for those communities. And so to be able to just look across the city and see these are the things that work in this ward and that ward that we haven't tried, that we refuse to try with respect to Native Black Washingtonians, makes it easier for us to do that kind of demechanization that's necessary to think about things much differently than they are today.
Thank you for that. Ben, I want to turn to you. I said at the outset that one of the themes that we're confronting right now is that, at least in the last 2 years, there's been an increase in violent crime, particularly shootings and homicides. But it's a more complicated picture than just that. Can you ground us in your Datalytics way about what we should understand about the crime trends that we're experiencing?
Sure, I don't have an interactive, dashboard to show everyone, but yeah, it's actually quite complex, and it's really important that we understand what's happening so that we can understand if the policy solutions we have implemented are working, if we should implement different solutions. Like, you have to understand the problem before you can try to start to solve it, and especially this engagement in this debate around seemingly are there trade-offs between these two different worlds, whether or not that really exists. So what we've seen is that in the mid-2010s, for some cities, they were already starting to experience an increase in gun violence, but it wasn't really a universal experience. And then from 2019 to 2020, we saw an explosion of gun violence across the country. Murders rose by one of the largest amounts we have. They continue to rise from 2020 to 2021. And that's where we will run into, I know we'll talk about some of the challenges with data later, but we run into one of our challenges. In 2021 was our first year using the new NIBRS program, new way of reporting crime statistics. Only 60% of police departments participated. So we had a profound limitation in our understanding of crime in the United States. And not only that, we don't know what happened last year. Right here we are in May. We're not going to know what happened in 2022 until September. So how can we engage in this debate whether or not we have all these different trade-offs supposedly, right? And all of that. What we have done with Datalytics is we've collected murder data from 90 to 100 cities, large cities, and use that to try to estimate murder across the United States. It's a decent proxy. It's within a couple percentage points of the trend at the end of the year. And what we have found is that from 2021 to 2022, murder has decreased and has started to return closer to what it was in 2020. And if the trends we've seen thus far through the first 4 months of the year hold, we have a significant decrease again this year, indicating that it's dropped further from the 2020 and 2021 peak. So that substantially changes our narrative understanding, and that's just of gun violence. We know during COVID that there was a reduction in mobility, so crimes of opportunity like robbery or burglary decreased. But one thing that has increased and we have considerable evidence suggesting it has increased nationwide since the fall has been auto thefts tied to the TikTok challenge. And if you have a Hyundai or Kia that uses a key from 2015 to 2020, go get their solution or something. But that's what we know. And if that's what we know, then how can we approach public safety differently? And then the last piece I'll add on this is within this incomplete data environment, within each of our communities are experiencing crime differently, and the rises in crime or the current environment of crime very differently, and varies considerably across every city. And so there's not a broad brush support of crime is X. It's crime in certain communities, in certain cities are up in certain areas or down in certain areas. And I mean, you were saying it far more eloquently than I did. And so I think that's worth considering when you start to solve these problems locally.
Ben, speak to this if you can. I mean, if you were to just watch the news or pay attention to the recent midterm elections, one would think that where we've seen rises in crime or in certain cities, or in places where where there's been pretrial reform or reform prosecutors who have been elected. Do you have a perspective about whether that in fact is a accurate articulation of where we have seen crime rise, or is there something more to be said about national trends?
From the data we have, the increase in 2020 and the increase in 2021, and the bit of data we collected around gun violence and murders in 2022 suggests it has happened everywhere. These trends are happening everywhere, whether it's a Democrat-led city or a Republican-led city, whether it's a city that had a progressive or a former district attorney that was elected or self-identified or however that they would identify themselves, and one who doesn't. So these trends have been a universal trend. They are born out or grew out of the experience of the pandemic and everything kind of that change with the way, you know, people went about their own self-protection, right? We know there's evidence that more people were more likely to carry a weapon on them and all the things that can lead to. So these are not, it's near universal experiences. Now, with that said, there might be some cities or some communities that maybe did a better job of mitigating that rise or ameliorating the effects of that, but the effects were widespread.
Thank you. Aswad, so we're talking about reimagining public safety. Can you talk a little bit, help us understand the importance of centering survivor voices in the movement for public safety?
You know, great question. So the Alliance for Safety and Justice, we began our work 10 years ago with a very unique perspective. We wanted to not only have a conversation about justice reform as it relates to reducing incarceration, but we actually wanted to have a real conversation about safety, a conversation with those communities that are most impacted by violence. Those same communities are most impacted by incarceration as well. So the past 10 years, we've been driving that work of what we call shared safety. So we have a justice system, a crime policy system that was designed to not meet the needs of our most unprotected community members across the country. We have a system that was built and founded and advocated for by politicians, law enforcement, but also some crime victims organizations, you know, advocating for more victim rights. But those victims excluded a huge community of survivors out there that didn't get any support at all. So just fast forward to 2009 when I became a victim of gun violence. I learned that two of the young men, the teenagers that were involved in my shooting were also victims of gun violence years before I got shot. And like me, they never received any services or resources to help them heal. And I strongly believe that unaddressed trauma played a huge role with me getting shot years later. That same year in 2009, that is when the United States had its highest peak at incarceration. And also there were billions of dollars in the Crime Victims' Rights Fund. But victims like me did not receive any services or support during that time. So think about 2009, you know, after my experience of being a victim of gun violence, I started to travel the country and talking to crime victims across the country about their experiences. Victims of gun violence, family members who've lost loved ones to homicide, victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, especially black crime victims who have been disregarded and disrespected for decades. We don't access victim services, we don't get victim compensation, and our voice, our experiences aren't at policy making tables, and the organizations that are on the front lines to violence don't get the necessary funding to do that work. So we started this network of crime survivors for safety and justice, of bringing those individuals, bringing those experiences to policy making tables to meet with legislators about what safety looks like to them. For crime victims, safety is more jobs, more housing, more trauma recovery service, more access to victim service. So when we actually partner, thank you. when you actually partner legislators with crime victims, what you have is policies that's co-developed, that's rooted in crime prevention, that's rooted in healing, that's rooted in mental health, that's rooted in reentry. So, not only survivors should be at the center of conversation about public safety, we actually should be driving it because we touch every level of the justice system.
Syrita, I'm going to get to you in a second, but I want to ask just a quick follow-up here. You generated a little bit of applause when you talked about some of the policy areas that, that could better serve victims and survivors of crime. Can you go a level deeper in terms of specifics of the kinds of policies, maybe that ASJ has won in some of the places, so people get a sense of the work and what you're being able to deliver through your approach?
So when you talk to crime victims, we all have unique experiences in different perspectives, right? But when you talk to crime victims about those experiences, there are some key things that we've learned over the years. Number one, the majority of crime victims do not access victim compensation. In fact, 96% of crime victims do not access victim compensation. The majority of crime victims do not access mental health, housing support, or any type of victim services in communities. The organizations that are actually, doing the work in communities who were founded by mothers who've lost their children to gun violence, been founded by DV survivors, those organizations do not access the funding that's needed to help them address the causes of violence in communities, also to help provide services. We've also learned that crime victims do not believe that being tough on crime is the solution to solve. It's to help us solve these issues that we have. So crime victims, want more rehabilitation rather than more punishment. Crime victims want shorter prison sentences rather than long-term prison sentences. And crime victims want what happened to us to never happen again. We also want those who are incarcerated to get the rehabilitation that they need. And we also want for those coming out of the justice system being able to access housing and jobs. So our organization, we've passed over 91 laws across the country to change victim compensation programs, to provide more protections for survivors, and to help build the infrastructure of victim services by developing trauma recovery centers. And we passed dozens of laws to reduce incarceration, incentivize people to get rehabilitation, and also being able to move about $1.3 billion out of the justice system to communities.
Thank you. So Syrita, and thank you for sharing your story of how you got involved in this work. I want to ask you, how can we ensure that more returning citizens are meaningfully involved in shaping policies that are related to public safety? And then it's a compound question. And then the second part of the question is, what are some examples of successful policy changes that have been shaped by people with lived experience? And I hope you talk about Pell, but anyway,
I'll slide it in there for you.
All right.
Well, I think initially the first part of your question about returning citizens, I might take some people aback here, but I didn't feel like a citizen when I was released back into the community, or essentially what I say is I felt like I had been kidnapped and just dropped back into community. In order to be considered a citizen, you're supposed to have the right to vote. You're supposed to have the right to safe and secure housing. You're supposed to be able to live life in pursuit of happiness. I'm supposed to be able to, bear arms and have freedom of speech. But when you're formerly incarcerated and you're being released into communities, you don't have any of those rights. So this whole terminology about, about returning citizens, a lot of times, a lot of people across the country feel left out, even though people are talking about them, because there's this thing that continues to happen where people decide what we should be called, how we should be talked about, what things we have access to, without actually asking us how we feel about it. So when you talk about returning citizens, in order for us to be returning citizens, we have to have our constitutional rights. And then it leaves out a whole nother piece of the conversation, as if detention for people who are involved in the immigration system don't deserve those same rights and protections, because we're talking about returning citizens. So not even being able to talk about the intersectionality of the immigration system and the criminal legal system is a fallacy that continues to separate all of the movements, right? But I do think that we are making strides across the country today where we are beginning to value lived experience. I think that inside of incarceration is probably the only discipline where the people who have been impacted the most are not consulted about any of these things. I often tell people, if you need legal advice, you're not going to go to a doctor, and if you need medical advice, you're not going to go to an attorney. But when you need advice on how to re-enter successfully into communities, the people who have done so are not even consulted or talked about, because there's this insinuation generally that people who have been to prison are somehow uneducated, and we need people to tell us what to do. So I think that moving away, as Patrice mentioned earlier, about drawing this line in movements, about who's valued, whose experience matters, how they contribute and communicate, is extremely important to us moving forward. As we talk about policy wins that we've had, I personally have been involved in passing 17 pieces of legislation across the country, really around education access. So it started from my experience of not being able to go to college when I was released from prison, and applying to the University of New Orleans and being denied, even though I had college credits, great GPA, and all of the other different things. The only thing I did was check the box on the college application, and I was denied within 24 hours. 2 years later, I decided to reapply. I used the same application, and the only thing I did was uncheck the box. And I was admitted within 24 hours. And thank you. Immediately, I knew that something had to change about that. I wanted to go to medical school. I ended up getting my degree from LSU in clinical laboratory science, because prior to my incarceration, education was never really an issue for me. It was the victim of trauma and, crimes that I had faced against myself growing up that led me to prison, which 96% of women who are incarcerated have a reported instance of trauma. 70% are dealing with mental health issues. So knowing all of this and knowing that it's unaddressed, and that's the gateway for women to be introduced in prison, but then once we're released, you can't access an education, really speaks volumes of how invested the country is in in being incentivized to continue to send people, to prison. And I could, we'll talk about things later, the 13th Amendment and how it's all set up to stay there. But saying all that to say that our first piece of legislation was the ban the box on college applications in Louisiana in 2017, which colleges could no longer ask about criminal history for purposes of admissions. Over the years since 2017, we've supported advocates in 7 other states to pass similar legislation. We're trying to pass it in 18 additional states over the next 2 years. But that led to work on being able to restore Pell for incarcerated students across this country. We were able to really draw and create the Unlock Higher Ed Coalition on the work that was done by great people. Dr. Nixon will be on stage after us, and all of the, legwork and all of the things that they put in place for us to be able to do it. But it wasn't until COVID and being able to put power restoration inside of a COVID omnibus bill with the protections of all of the other things that we were able to get it passed, along with FAFSA simplification. It was really out of removing question 23 and 24 off of the FAFSA, but what ended up happening was something that benefited everybody. It went to 8 questions, So there's a lot of great work that formerly incarcerated folks are doing a lot are in the audience and be on stage later, that we're quietly doing that nobody knows that we're responsible for. But for us, it's a life or death situation.
Syrita, react to this. I don't think formerly incarcerated. So let me just, by way of background, I've worked in this space for about 25 years. When I first started working at Vera as a legal intern, one of the first people that I met was the great Eddie Ellis, who was at Open Society. I'm up here on stage with you. I think about some of the leaders on the Vera staff, Maurice Smith, George Chochos, John Bay. I think about Terrell Blount out here.
Right there.
Right there. I can't see a thing, but there you are, my man. And I see you leading. I feel incredibly enthusiastic about the change that I have seen. Are you? But you sound less optimistic. You sound like you don't think the field has centered leaders who have been impacted enough.
I think that's a double sword, question. I think that while generally in communities, people are moving toward an acceptance of formerly incarcerated people having value, we are still creating this atmosphere of exceptionalities, right? So you hold up formerly incarcerated people who have made tremendous strides. But if I'm honest with you, what led me to prison was trauma, not my socioeconomic background. My mom was a judge before I went to prison. I had been to Europe at the age of 9. So I had experiences and things to draw onto. So you know how you tell people just pull themselves up by their bootstraps? I've always had boots. Not everybody else has them, right? So really to talk about in the way that we're moving, absolutely, people are granted in spaces, but I also remember Fred Patrick and having conversations with him prior to him being deceased and working at Vera, and him not necessarily leading with the fact that he was formerly incarcerated because it didn't always feel comfortable, for him to do so, and what would the backlash be. So we have a lot of people who are still in hiding because the environments in which they work in and thrive are not inviting for them. When I ran for U.S. Senate last year against John Kennedy in Louisiana, the biggest thing people were telling me is that, are you ready for them to use your past against you? And I'm still in this day and age, as a black woman who has made all of these strides, the first thing that you see is that I'm formerly incarcerated, right? I can take the heat. I know how intelligent that I am, but some people can't. So what I do is I want to make sure that we bring light to, I am not an exception. I am someone that God has given the ability to be able to stand in the gap and take the heat to make sure that everyone can access things in the same way that I can access. And if I can't, I'm going to give them access to those things. So for me, I think that, yes, while we have made strides, we still have a long way to go. And the work that I do right now is for 40 years from now. So everything that I do is for 40 years from now.
We have about a little less than 15 minutes left, so I want to switch gears. And Patrice, I want to ask you a question. You've kind of been through it this, this winter and spring in D.C. There's an issue, generally speaking, of preemption. We see it around the country. I mean, we have all, I think everyone in this room has experienced, blowback and the headwinds over the past few years from gains that we'd made in the past. That has happened in D.C. We look around state legislatures. We see lots of efforts to remove prosecutors, reform prosecutors, or to provide a different kind of oversight. Mississippi, Georgia, Pennsylvania, I mean, the list goes on and on. But in DC, maybe you can talk a little bit about the experience that was most recently had in DC and what we can do to address issues of preemption at the local level. And you may need to describe, I may not have done a good job, so you may need to describe you know what I mean by preemption, but they may not, so.
Sure. So Washington, D.C. has spent the last 16 years in an effort to rewrite its criminal laws and penalties in a way that prosecutors and defense attorneys and legal scholars and others all agreed on, and in a way that our majority Black city council unanimously passed through 2 votes at the end of last year, only to have Congress and the President of the United States tell us that we will have to live with our existing code, which was not updated since it was adopted in 1901, and doesn't spell out basic definitions of things like self-defense, assault, manslaughter, and other things that you would expect to see in the law if you wanted to understand what is a crime and what is not a crime. And it was a dramatic illustration that people who claim to be in favor of law and order are not actually looking for law or order, that this is about something else. And DC's fight for local autonomy and statehood has always been a racial justice movement. It's been interesting to see the pattern emerging in all of the places that you named, and in Tennessee and Texas and Florida, and I'm learning also in Louisiana as well, that there is this pattern of majority white legislative bodies undoing and preempting the work of people who want to have a say in making our laws better and our cities and other jurisdictions much safer. And we learned pretty early on in starting DC Justice Lab that we would have to include in our agenda more than just the policies we wanted to change, but changes to policy making and changes to who was going to be making these policies. And it's just proven harder over time the more success we've had. And so that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the backlash that we see. We really did change a lot of laws in a very short period of time in DC, and I think that's part of why the attention landed there. And it was a very hard loss. We will continue fighting for a new criminal code, and it's hard to even talk about. And now you've brought up the Hyundai thing. I lost a Hyundai too, Ben. Like, it's been a really hard year. But we'll continue moving forward and passing all of the other laws that we've been working on since 2020.
Do any of you think that there's a way we can address this backlash, this onslaught of preemptions? I mean, DC is a crystal clear example, and made national headlines. I don't know if I believe the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, was supposed to be here. I don't know if he was able to make it, but they've had their own thing with the Mississippi legislature. We obviously have had, attempted impeachments of reform prosecutors in blue and purple places, in California and in Pennsylvania. What do we do to address this and combat it? Anyone have thoughts on that?
We have to build power. We got to build power in communities. Most movements, right, that have been successful has been the power of the people. It's really about bringing together crime victims and people formerly incarcerated to fly this plane to safety. That's how we're going to get there. But we also have to really continue to think about safety. So we just launched a public education campaign called Just Safe, and it's asking voters what does safety means to them. What they are saying, and it resonates everywhere, safety is more jobs, more housing, prevention, mental health, wellness, trauma, recovery. So safety isn't the absence of crime. Safety is the presence of well-being.
Syrita.
Yeah, and I just really want to lift up the fact that when this is happening in places like DC and other places, these majority white legislative bodies, as you mentioned earlier, like we have in Louisiana, are taking watch and they're launching pilot programs. We have one that just is trying to be launched this legislative session. It's called Truth and Transparency in Criminal Justice. Louisiana has 64 parishes, but they want to pilot the 3 largest parishes that have the most Black residents to have truth and transparency in criminal justice. So they want all of the information as it relates to criminal proceedings to be made public and be accessible at any time, because they are concerned about transparency in high crime rate areas. Jefferson Parish is also, in Louisiana, is one of the highest incarcerators in the state as well as in the country. And there's no truth and transparency in Jefferson Parish, but Jefferson Parish is 80% white and about 90% Republican. So they don't really care about the high crime instances in parishes of that sort. Only the 3 major Black urban areas of East Baton Rouge, Orleans, and Caddo Parish. So when you talk about laying the groundwork for preemption, this is where it starts. This is when it happens. And we all have to be paying attention to it. But I think, Brian Stevenson says it best about narrative work. And that is where we really have to get into the depths and change the narratives that are being perpetuated around what is actually going on, what is happening, and the intent. What I found out, and, we all know across the country, voter turnout is getting lower and lower. We gotta, add in the gerrymandering. We gotta talk about voter suppression. We have to talk about all of those things. But even in the absence of those things, people are not going to vote because they do not feel that it matters. People are not talking about local elections being decided with less than 100 votes. People are not talking about the importance of actually making sure that people have access to being able to vote, and why should they be going out to vote? And I think until we do a massive, and I don't mean regular voter turnout, but narrative change and education work on why it is important for people to get out and how that is the only way some things will be addressed outside of litigation and legislation and all of those things. I think that people are not motivated because they don't feel like they matter, because nothing that is going on in the country resembles what is happening to them. And then we also have to raise up this narrative and really expose that 96% of people who are in federal government are independently wealthy, right? So people that are making laws and making decisions and creating the policies that will guide us are only making those decisions with the 1% in mind.
We have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you just to step back and speak for a minute, answer this question. The question is glass half full or glass half empty, okay? So we've talked about preemption. We've talked about crappy data, but we've talked about the availability of new, more accurate data. We talked about a survivors movement that I've got to say is so contrary. Those of us who are old in the tooth remember the crime victims movement of the 90s and the 80s. Looks very different now, seeking to accomplish different things. We've talked about exceptional leadership, exceptional both in terms of excellence, but then also in terms of people being exceptionalized, yet progress being made. Let's leave the audience somewhere, and each of you all speak to this. Glass half full or glass half empty?
Oh, boy. So I guess you're hoping I set a trend somehow. I guess it's hard to go about any work and think about the world you want to leave your children and think of the glass being half empty. So I think you have to approach it from that perspective, or at least I do. And I do think there is a lot that we know about how to make data available to people. We know the type of conversations the public is having. So let's help communities provide that data to their communities to understand if the public safety environment that they're in is providing them the outcomes that they want, and then let's be able to engage in those conversations and empower local communities to make the decisions that are right for them. So I guess I'm optimistic that we wouldn't be sitting in this spot if we didn't think that would happen.
I'll say half full, and that optimism comes directly from the students that I work with. And I think if you get to spend time in classrooms with people who are in undergraduate study or law school nowadays, it makes it very easy for you to see that the future looks very different than it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago when we were in those spaces. So I'm very excited to see what changes going forward, and I expect to see a huge shift in my career.
Half full, but it's going to take radical thinking of our agencies, our policy, our funding to get to the safety that we all want and that we all deserve. It's going to take all of us in this room to play our part in it.
Syrita.
Yeah, half full. I've done a lot of work over the years to work on my subconscious and make sure that I'm not noticing the absence, but only what's present. So I notice what's present at every moment, and I'm extremely excited about the people that we are connected to in this work and how we're talking about it. I don't even notice, what we're missing. So my hope is that we all can get to a space of being appreciative for what's there, and that we all move into the, the space of next together.
I think the four of you embody what we just talked about. Hope is a discipline. It's not some fuzzy thing that we all just see out there, and it's discipline, right? It's hard work. It's excruciating to reach it. You wake up every morning and you work for it, and that's what all of you are doing. So I leave this stage feeling very hopeful and very grateful to be able to be on the stage with the four of you. Let's everyone give our panel a really warm round of applause. Thank you. It looks like we have time for Q&A. Is that right? How much time do we have? 15 minutes? Okay. I see a raspberry beret out there. Please stand up, introduce yourself, and if you have a question to, are there microphones? No? So just, I guess, project your voice, please, introduce yourself, and if you have a question to direct to someone in particular, please do.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the work that you all are doing. My name is Syrita Steib. I've been working in the space of water, environmental justice. And one of the things that I've been really studying is the effects of lead on the thinking and the minds of people, and the root causes of issues and why they happen. Have you guys considered, like, the root causes of why things are happening besides the police and all these other things? Why are these things happening in our communities? If you look at Black and brown communities or low-income communities, they are disproportionately affected by unhealthy or the inadequate access to safe foods, bad air pollution, right? Unsafe homes. All these things are root causes as to why things are happening. Have you considered those things in doing this work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for the work that you are doing. When you think about this criminal justice system, right, how we've invested billions of dollars into the criminal justice system, we took out those investments away from communities, right? So the problems that we have as it relates to housing, education, resources for our communities across the country, where's the funding? The funding is in the broken criminal justice system. So you look at where all the resources, look at your state budgets, look at the law enforcement budget, look at the criminal justice budget, but then look at your school budget, right? Then look at the services for resources and communities. And so it's the intersections of all of these issues play a huge role in the work that we all are doing. So just imagine if we, take those billions of dollars that we're investing in the criminal justice system that's not working, that's not keeping us safe. What if we invested every dollar back into communities? Our country would have a huge shift.
But, I'm sorry. Yeah, what I want to say is being from Louisiana, somewhere right now where environmental justice is our existence. My mom is from St. John Parish, which is called Cancer Alley across the United States. My mom is an attorney who's actually fighting against DuPont and Dinka for the chloroprene emissions in the environment. I never thought about social justice and environmental justice being something separate, right? They're all symptoms of the same community. So when you have people who are a part of poverty, who have a lack of education, who cannot escape rural communities, they are impacted by multiple things, right? The same people, if you look at it in Louisiana prisons, there's a gentleman, I can't even recall his name right now, who used environmental data to get a prison shut down because prisons are also one of the #1 polluters, right? And how people are being exposed to things. So when you talk about being exposed to lead and asbestos and, pollution, it happens 10 times over in prisons. There's no emergency evacuation plans for hurricanes, for people that are incarcerated. You can see the images across your television every time a natural disaster happens. What happens in prisons, right? I think that, environmental justice, social justice, criminal legal system work is all hinged upon public health, right? So all of these are public health issues. I think when we have opportunities, as you did, and thank you for bringing that up, to point out that they are all symptoms of the same problems and that they are all interconnected. And the more that we do that and the more that we lift it up in that way, people from multiple movements are able to connect and work together to solve their problems.
Mass criminalization is a root cause of crime at this point, at the levels that we're doing it. The reason that other countries don't do this is not just that it's enormously expensive and a waste of money, it's that we know there is such a thing as over-punishment and that you can make people less safe. It should be obvious that if you go into a neighborhood, remove all the men, put them in cages, and traumatize them for years and send them back, we don't end up with less crime. And I think we are doing ourselves a disservice by not recognizing that aggressive policing and state violence are causing just as much trauma as the community violence is when we're doing it at the levels that we've decided to do it in the United States.
Do we have another question? I see someone waving their hand up there.
Thank you very much, sir. John Horwitz, Director for Policy at the Urban League in Atlanta. A New Yorker by birth, but now I live in a red state. It's totally different bag. So for those of us who live in red states, dealing with state legislatures, how do we confront that? I mean, so whether it's Georgia or Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi, it's a different landscape. And how do we deal with those in terms of pushing progressive legislation?
So living in Louisiana, a red state, and having success passing multiple pieces of legislation, anybody who knows me knows I'm not best for decorum. So, when I say this, please, I'm just going to say it, right? When we did the ban the box legislation in Louisiana, the first time we went up, I had my then partner and myself. She had all the statistics. She was a PhD student in Tulane University, and I had the story, right? And we talked about the importance of having education, all of the impacts on recidivism. We had our dog and pony show ready to go. We knew they could not respond to all of this that we provided. And what I didn't realize in that moment, what I was not ready for, was this zeroing in of me as a Black woman who committed a crime, and I did not deserve an education. Why did I deserve access to this? And I was so taken aback. We had a legislator on the committee at the time, and he was like, you need to pull back and y'all need to regroup, re-strategize. And I went home and I'm like, Lord, what are we gonna do? And it just came to me, it was like, they can't connect to you. Is it personal for you? Or do you need to pass this legislation? So I found a white woman who had the same story that I had. And she went up and testified, and the legislation passed unanimously. They told her to hold her head up. She was gonna be somebody. I mean, she got a standing ovation and everything, right? But I had to learn that lesson early on because I also, disclaimer, like to cuss. So I had walked out of the legislature, I screamed, I hollered, I cussed a little while, and then I came back in, right? And I sat down. But what it taught me in that moment is that the minute I approached this work personally, I lose. And it couldn't be about me. It had to be about the people that I was fighting for. So I had to take myself out, really walk back the need to be validated. That's why I get up every morning and validate myself. And really, really approach the work in a way that I'm working toward true liberation. So if I have to use a dog to do that and teach him how to talk, that's what we're gonna do. So finding that woman and approaching the work in that way is the reason why we have been so successful. But that's also acknowledging the systemic issues and the racism and all of that. But if you're gonna do work in red states and be successful, you can't wanna be the face of the movement.
And I'll just add, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, a lot of our reforms have been in red states like Florida, Texas, or Ohio. A lot of the work that we are doing is with bipartisan leadership, right? So when I talked about victim compensation, those reforms happen in red states. When I talk about probation reforms, when I talk about trauma recovery centers, those have been in a lot of our red states. It's really about bringing the voices of survivors together in those states to let policymakers know that passing these reforms is public safety, ensuring that the voices of survivors are at the center of these conversations, but also shifting the narrative in the media as well, which has been huge for our movement across the country, is working with bipartisan leaders.
Okay, Carol, you call on someone. So.
I was hoping that maybe all of you, but particularly you, Aswad, could speak about, well, this false dichotomy between being a victim or a survivor and being somebody that has committed a crime. I know from lived experience, but just also being a Black person in the world, that it's a slippery slope, and we live, right, and he's a very fluid victim one day and maybe an arrested person the next day. So I wanted to point out that that dichotomy that I think is a false dichotomy, but really invite everyone to speak to this divide and conquer business, this pitting against each other of victims and people who maybe have been accused of crimes, or people, in the safety conversation. I actually think that, I think that Patrice, you talked about things happening in cycles and nothing new being under the sun, and we've seen the divide and conquer tactic happen in just about every movement. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the weaponization, right, this co-opting especially of victims and of survivors, and kind of this holding victims up, even though we don't get services or treatment, but holding victims up as the flag bearers of movement and pitting them against people who are really liberation-minded.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And so, majority of us, have been victims of a violent crime, but it's not rare, right, for us, for a family, for a mother to have a son who she's buried, but also have another son that's incarcerated. The Alliance for Safety and Justice, we're planning to release a report this week that's really highlighting what Syrita said, which is that 9 out of 10 individuals with past convictions have been a victim of a crime at some point in their life. And the majority of them were victims before they ever even came in contact with the justice system. So just as there is, this dual exclusion for victims and people with past convictions, the policy barriers continue to, to have ripple effects on individuals as well. So if you are someone on probation or parole, you might not be eligible for victim compensation, even though you were a victim of a violent crime. So we have to get rid of that false dichotomy of, there's victims and people that's caused harm. They are the same. They are in our families. They are in our community. That's why we have to address these policies, make sure we're removing barriers for formerly incarcerated folks, removing barriers to victims as well. That's the work that we all have to do, and it starts with narrative shifting as well.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more question. I see lots of, I'm going to ask President Mason to. Okay, smart move, smart move.
And thank you for uplifting that. Also, my condolences to you and your family, but also for your courage in helping to make that decision, which I know was an easy decision. And what we have to do is exactly what you said. We have to really overhaul this victim compensation program. We have to overhaul victim services. It starts with actually taking it out of the justice system. That's not a place for healing and services for people.
I just wanted to add to the previous comment before. We also, as a community of practitioners who do this work, cannot subscribe and continue to add to the culture of separate and divide. I remember I was contacted based on my work in Louisiana to become a policy consultant for Cut 15 to work on the First Step Act, which led me to receiving a full presidential pardon from Trump on his last day in office. But I remember the people that dragged me the most about going into the White House were my comrades that I worked every single day in the social justice liberation movement. And what I told them and what I said to them is that, they were like, oh, Trump is going to close down all public schools in this country and just all of these different things. And I was like, well, where were y'all when New Orleans became 100% charter? The reality that a lot of people on the West Coast and the East Coast are afraid that it's going to come up is the reality that I get up and I live in every single day. So to tell me that I am not supposed to work because of who's in office would mean that I can't work at home because that is my reality. So a lot of us in the South, the things that people in other geographical areas are afraid of, is something that we live with every single day. So how do we begin to support each other, even if we don't understand the geographies in which other folks live and the systems in which we fight? While we're all fighting systems, some are more archaic than others, and how do you support and pass down information that if I am doing something successfully in these places, that I don't have to learn these ecosystems on my own, that you can pass on the mistakes and the information that you've learned instead of saying, hey, I don't necessarily appreciate how you're doing the work or how you're approaching it. So we also have to stop allowing outside entities to come in and allow ourselves to be pitted against one another for this divide and conquer.
So we have to wrap. Once more, a big round of applause for our panel and for you all. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Hi. My name is Diane Wachtel, and I'm the executive director of The New Press, which is a book publishing company. Why is a book publisher here talking at a criminal justice conference. Well, the subject of the next panel is a totally wonderful book that the New Press published last year called Parsimony and Other Radical Ideas About Justice. Parsimony, that's an interesting word. I was mispronouncing it for a long time. It's not parsimony, it's parsimony. And I think some of us know about being parsimonious from our financial lives, where you spend the least possible amount of money to get what you want. And so the radical idea of this book is that we should exert the least possible force and coercion to get the safety and justice that we want in our society. I'm just going to back up a minute and talk for 2 seconds about the New Press. I hope you've heard of us. We're a not-for-profit public interest publisher, kind of like PBS and NPR in their realms. We've been publishing on criminal justice reform since the last millennium. I looked at the audience, and y'all look awfully young to me, so I don't know whether you're going to recognize names like Paul Chevigny, who wrote a book about police brutality back in the 90s, maybe David Cole, who's now running the ACLU, who did a book about double standards in the criminal justice system, Marc Mauer, Race to Incarcerate, Nell Bernstein on juvenile justice, Mariam Kaba more recently, No More Police. I'm hoping some of these are resonating with at least some of you. And then we published a little-known law professor from Ohio, a woman named Michelle Alexander. I'm guessing a few of you have heard of hers. Anyhow, we are the very, very proud publishers of Parsimony, and I believe in the next break there will be free copies in the atrium, and I hope that all of you will avail yourselves of those. It's a terrific book full of radical ideas about how to reform justice. I think we now have a brief video about the book.
The title of the book is Parsimony and Other Radical Ideas About Justice.
Parsimony. Parsimony? Great question. That's a good question. I actually don't have an answer.
When I first heard the word parsimony, it's like, ooh, parsimony, that's a cool word. I should figure out what this means.
Most of the people in the room didn't know what that meant. Oh, is that a spice?
Parsley?
Is that some golf term?
Like, no, parsimony.
Parsimony is the least drastic, punitive measure that can be applied to affect public safety.
At what level should the state be intervening in an individual's life? Like, full stop. How do you preserve someone's liberty and also hold them accountable?
Amid all of the different reforms that are going around the country now, drug defelonisation, legalisation of cannabis, police reforms, it still feels insufficient. We need to re-examine the foundations of the system.
The concept of parsimony is just one of the radical ideas about justice that's surfaced in the book.
Abolition is a radical idea. It proposes a world without punishment as one of the core ways to organize society. Vivian Nixon's chapter around reckoning with white supremacy is really radical.
If we're not going to tell the truth, if we're not going to deal with the reality of who we are as a country, then there's no point in having a conversation about justice.
The whole lie of mass incarceration was that safety could be produced through violence. The book is urging us to go back to those foundational values. What should our justice system rest on?
If we're going to make real change in our justice system, we're going to have to change the way we think and talk about safety.
We don't have safe societies because we have lots of police in prison. The political framing has been more punishment, less crime, more prisons, more safety, and we have to break that nexus.
I envision a system where people can be held accountable and heal.
I was an instrument of mass incarceration for 17 years. When I go through all the people I sentenced, I believe that 80% of the sentences were unfair, unjust, and disproportionate.
There's an undoing project that we have to do after 40 years of mass incarceration.
When people read the book, I hope they take away a new way of imagining what's possible. Understanding that there are other ways to think about this is really important.
It's square one thinking. You do short-term thinking, and it isn't until years and years of short-term thinking that you look back and you say, my God, what have we created?
It's going to take more than just abolishing anything. We have to build systems that make communities safe.
We don't have to settle for the status quo, nor do we have to settle for small incremental changes. Rules can be rewritten. And we are at the cusp of building a groundswell of people ready to rewrite the rules.
The book is offering a bunch of different ideas. There isn't one silver bullet to solve mass incarceration. There's not gonna be one expert who's gonna solve this. It's gonna take all of us.
The moderator of the panel discussion, Lawrence Bartley. Lawrence is the publisher of the Marshall Project Inside, which is the Marshall Project's publication suite intended specifically for incarcerated audiences. He is the host and the executive producer of Inside Story, a new video series delivering trustworthy reporting to incarcerated people and the broader public. And he has served as the founder and director of News Inside, which is the print publication of the Marshall Project, distributed in hundreds of prisons and jails throughout the United States. Please join me in welcoming Lawrence Bartley.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next up, we have an amazing panel. They need no introductions, but I'm gonna do it anyway. First up, we have Jeremy Travis. Jeremy is the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, where he leads a team that is implementing reform strategies focused on policing, pretrial justice, community supervision, prisons, and reintegration. Jeremy joined Arnold Ventures after serving as 13 years as president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Welcome, Jeremy. Next up, we have Danielle Surratt. Danielle is Executive Director of Common Justice, which develops and advances solutions to violence. That's right, there she is. That meets the needs of those harmed, advance racial equity, and do not rely on incarceration. Before launching Common Justice, Danielle served as a Deputy Director of Vera's Adolescent Reentry Initiative, a program for young men returning from incarceration on Rikers Island. Give her another round of applause, please. Next up, we have Bruce Western. Come on out, Bruce. Bruce is the director. Yeah, give him a round of applause. Bruce is the director of Columbia University's Justice Lab and Bryce Professor of Sociology at Columbia University. He is the author of Punishment and Inequality in America and Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison. One more time for Bruce. And last but definitely not least is Vivian Nixon, Reverend Vivian D. Nixon. Vivian is a writer in residence at the Square One Project, which you'll hear a lot about today. She worked with College and Community Fellowship, a collective of women rebuilding their lives through education from 2001 to 2020. Driven by hope in a world where systems do not harm, Vivian writes across genres to advance ideas about social justice and personal well-being. One more time, give me a round of applause for my panelists. Hello, can y'all hear me well? So without further ado, we're gonna get right into it. Now, we saw a video about parsimony, but I'd like Jeremy to tell us, what is parsimony as it relates to this book?
So let me first just thank Carol Mason and the John Jay community and the National Urban League for this just remarkable gathering. We need this sort of get together in our community. It's been a long time. The pandemic has really sort of stressed our relationship, so it's just great to be here, and thanks to Lawrence also for moderating today. So parsimony. It's wonderful to see the video because it sort of says a lot about sort of what it's not, and you get these startled looks when you say we're talking about parsimony, and it's not a New York Times word of the week. It's not spice. It's not all these things, but it is this really powerful idea, and my sort of connection with the word parsimony in part dates back to my work with Bruce on the National Academy of Sciences report on mass incarceration, where we said there were certain values that the country had not paid attention to sufficiently in the ramp-up of incarceration in America. Proportionality, dignity, and social justice, but one of them was parsimony. And so we've carried this idea forward into the Square One project, and one of my sort of fellow travelers in the parsimony campaign to get this word into our lexicon is Darrell Atkinson. Darrell, as you may know, is the director of the Forward Justice Project in North Carolina, first Second Chance Fellow in the Obama administration, and a proponent of parsimony. So we connected in the Square One project, in the executive session, and decided to write a chapter that became a chapter in the book. Thank you to the New Press. On parsimony, and thank you to Diane Wachtel saying this word should be in the title because it's so odd and sort of strange and new and sort of edgy that it's going to increase sales. That's why I love this idea. Parsimony is going to actually increase sales of this book. So parsimony is a central idea to how we think about state power. So what parsimony does is to center liberty as being a preeminent value that we should protect. So we have to protect liberty against the excessive exercise of state power in the way that Judge Gertner articulated on the film. So the clearest, succinct definition is parsimony requires that the exercise of state power, coercive state power under the color of law, be no more than that which is reasonably required to carry out a legitimate social purpose. So that definition, a little long, but look, has liberty, has limitation on power, has limitation that reasonably necessary, but it can be applied to, as Darrell and I do in the chapter, to all sorts of aspects of the criminal justice system. We, as a mind exercise, said, well, let's apply parsimony to sentencing. Let's apply parsimony to collateral sanctions. Let's apply parsimony to solitary. So it's a way of thinking about and critiquing everything that we do, but also centers liberty, recognizes the legitimacy of state power in certain circumstances, but also says that any time the state exercises more power than what is parsimoniously required, that is gratuitous and state violence. So it's a way of calling out the exercise of state power beyond that reasonably necessary and holding it up for critique. And the final thing I'll say is that in the chapter, and this is really Darrell's contribution to the parsimony discussion, he says we need to sort of think about this as being sort of an exercise of the social contract, and that the social contract has never been legitimately rooted in a multiracial democracy, actually has been sort of a privilege only to white people. So to get to the point where parsimony really becomes an active idea, we need to have a reckoning with that history. So it's read the chapter, buy the book, or get the book for free, and join the parsimony parade.
Thank you. Now, Bruce, Jeremy mentions Darrell Atkinson, and I know there are about 29 contributors to this book, and they all come from the Square One Project Executive Summary. Can you tell me a little bit about the Square One Project Executive Summary and how it relates to this book?
Yeah. I want to add my thanks to you, Lawrence, too, for moderating, and thanks to Carol and John Jay for organising this extraordinary event over these couple of days. An executive session, so all of us here on stage met as an executive session along with about 25 other people. We met over a period of 3 years, starting before the pandemic, back in 2018, 2019, I think was our very first meeting. And the idea of an executive session is that a group of people meet in a sustained way to address a fundamental and complex policy problem. And this particular executive session had its origins in the work that Jeremy and I were doing on the National Academy of Sciences report on very high incarceration rates. And a key finding of that report, as some of you may know, was that prisons and punishment in the American criminal justice system is radically overused, historically overused, and has generated incarceration rates at a level that we've never seen before. And after the report came out, Jeremy and I were talking about, what could we do next? And so if we sort of rewind the tape back to 2015, 2016, there were tons of reform efforts going on around the country, and we were hoping, I think, to provoke a conversation around really foundational change in the system, really trying to rethink the fundamentals of the public policy response to serious violence that's often generated in context of very severe racial inequality and injustice and conditions of very severe poverty. And so we're trying to think, how could we provoke such a conversation in an executive session among 30 experts from around the country? And we felt that one way of approaching this ambitious kind of agenda was by trying to make explicit the fundamental values on which the system should stand. And at that time, we're really thinking about three key values. One was social justice, which means a fair distribution of rights, resources, and opportunities. And as we know, our prison system has been an engine for racial inequality for decades and decades now. And so we have to address the challenge of social justice. The second fundamental value was human dignity. And here we were thinking that innate to every person is a deep capacity for love and creativity, and accompanying that capacity is an entitlement to treatment with dignity and respect. And our state institutions should treat people with dignity and respect. And that's the value of human dignity. And then the third value coming out of the NAS report was the value of parsimony that Jeremy described. And it's really a limitation on state power, as Jeremy said, and a prohibition on state cruelty. Norval Morris has this term, state cruelty, when the state overreaches and punishment is gratuitous. That's tantamount to cruelty. So that was a third guiding value in rethinking the fundamentals of the system. So a group of us met, diverse backgrounds, diverse kinds of expertise, very multidisciplinary group, met for a period of 3 years, and everyone was assigned the task of writing a paper. You had to write a paper that came out of these conversations that we were having over this 3-year period. And during this period, people are beginning to develop a shared language, a shared conceptual framework, and these papers became the basis for the volume that we're talking about today.
Great, thank you. I have a very hard question for Danielle Surratt, the hardest question of the day. We hear Bruce talking about the reshaping the fundamentals of the system, but there still is crime. There's folks who say there's crime all over. And you wrote a chapter in the book, let me get this right, what makes a city state safe? Strategies that don't rely on police and prisons. So we're at the Safe and Just Community Summit. So send everyone home with the answer, how do we make the city safe?
Thank you, and a huge shout out to Amanda Alexander, who's the co-author of that chapter and remains continuously one of my greatest teachers in this work and in this movement. I mean, I think the first thing we have to understand, and just so you know, these lights are totally blinding for us. So if you're rolling your eyes, you have to also make a sound with it, so we know. You have to be like, ah, because otherwise we won't feel your reactions. We cannot secure safety by force. And I don't say that as a philosophical view, though I actually hold that as a philosophical view. I say that just as a pragmatic observation about what does and doesn't work to secure safety. We hold this unrelenting commitment as a nation to policing and prosecution and incarceration, despite its unbroken history of maintaining and enforcing vast racial inequities since the founding of this nation. We hold a commitment to those practices despite their debilitating focus on interpersonal behavior, on individual behavior rather than structural drivers. And by debilitating, I mean something that renders it impossible that the thing will work. We retain that attachment despite all the evidence that shows that prisons are criminogenic, meaning they are likelier to increase the likelihood that someone will commit further harm rather than decrease it. For those of us who are students of violence, that's not surprising. We know the core drivers of violence are structural. They are poverty, they are inequity, they are the enforcement of disparities and how those show up in institutions like education and medicine and across the board. But even on an individual level, the drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. So we have baked into our core responses to violence exactly the things that generate those. That's not what you do. It's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline. Like, you're dishonest if you act surprised when the flames rage higher. And so one of the first things we do if we want to eradicate violence is we examine every single instance in which we use incarceration, not just through a lens that treats incarceration as an overused but often necessary approach, right? That's something sort of like medicine that someone could overdose on, right? And you're careful to make sure that the prescription is appropriate and isn't excessive. But as poison, right? As poison that brings harm to people, that passes through generation, that gets into the water supply and into the air supply every time we deploy it. And if we think of it in that way, we have a much different relationship to the decision about when we would deploy these tools. There are things that work to secure safety. They are, generally speaking, the inversion of all the drivers of violence, right? It's not like a trick, right? We have enough. We have the money, we have the means, we have the knowledge, we have the wherewithal, we have the people to be safe if we want to, right? We invest in institutions that educate people, that heal people, that treat people's medical and mental health needs. We invest in neighborhoods that are beautiful and strong and resilient. We invest in the repair of past harms. We can do all of that, and we could do that with the budgets that we currently spend on getting people into cages through long, expensive processes and retaining them there. And so it's not unavailable to us. It's just a question of whether we will choose it. And more, I think the question before us as a culture is like whether we mostly want to be a culture of belonging and repair, where like what we do in response to harm is repair, or whether we continue to want to be a culture of revenge. The core value that undergirds our criminal legal response is revenge. Because the only way doing something that has criminogenic effects, so that harms the person you're punishing, that harms that person's family and children, that harms everyone who loves that person, that has intergenerational effects, and that increases the likelihood they'll commit more harm. The reason we keep is we somehow think our desire for revenge, our desire to just sort of exact pain from someone who has caused pain, is more important to us than the actual efficacy of the response. And we do that in the face of thousands and thousands of crime survivors. And you heard Aswad earlier talking about ASJ's research on these topics. Thousands of survivors who tell us that's not what they want, and we continue to exact that revenge in their names. That seems wildly inappropriate and unethical. Some of the solutions that Amanda and I write about sort of fall into a few categories. One is public health responses, so community violence intervention, hospital-based responses. Do not miss like Fatima Dreyer's session later this afternoon on the work at the Javi that supports this stuff nationally. But there are countless grassroots groups all over with people who will literally stand in the line of fire and where their greatest leverage is relationship. That makes sense because the biggest fundamental producer of safety is relationship. So it's a valuable tool to use. When somebody is acting poorly, you are much likelier to get out with a good outcome if you have somebody who is in a relationship with that person than a stranger with a weapon. And you just think about in your house, if something were going badly, which would make you feel safer. The second category of interventions we talk about are things that meet people's material needs, right? And that both means things that prevent crimes that are specifically about getting money, getting enough to pay rent, to have food on the table, to not be rendered homeless, but also about creating the conditions in which people can live dignified lives in which they can trust that they can care for the people they love and meet those basic needs. And those include programs that do job development, that do kind of employment access, that remove barriers to people accessing meaningful work, and enabling people to do dignified work at a dignified wage, like a living wage. They include programs related to healing, knowing that cycles of violence are produced in part by past harms, both on the interpersonal and on the cultural level. That absent our healing of the pain that has come before us, our chances of being a society without future pain are basically zero. So looking at healing work that happens all over the country where people are pouring into processes that help people come through the harm that has happened to them, and doing that in a way that is autonomous of a criminal legal system that has never been built for healing. And I don't even say that as a critique, I just say that as an observation of what its function is and isn't in our culture. And then the last category are restorative and transformative justice programs. So programs and interventions that look at instances of harm and come to that harm with the actual tools to address what happened, address its impact, make things as right as possible, and transform the outcomes so no one involved will ever harm anyone ever again. And it's our belief, Amanda's and mine, and many thousands more in our movement, that the combination of those strategies can, will, and to the extent safety already exists, already do produce the kind of safety that, that people have always deserved, that have always been denied to Black and Brown communities, and that is available to us if we chose to take that path instead of the one to which we've been dedicated so firmly and so religiously, even as it requires us to continuously violate our most basic values to stay there.
Thank you. Dr. Nixon, you wrote a daring piece, look at you. You wrote a daring piece about confronting white supremacy. Can you tell us what lessons and themes do you want people to take away from it as it relates to safety and justice and all the subjects that we heard today?
Thank you, Lawrence, for agreeing to moderate this panel. Thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting us, and to my fellow panelists who are wonderful colleagues and friends. I'm really grateful to be here. Probably many people in the audience who I haven't seen since pre-pandemic, but I can't see any of you. But it's nice to almost see you again. So, you know, my idea of approaching this was to really get to the bottom of this. So when I say we need to confront white supremacy, I'm not saying we need to have a one-on-one confrontation with every white supremacist. What I'm saying is we need to look at the ways in which white supremacy is such an insidious presence in all of our systems and structures in this country, that this legacy, the ideology of whiteness, is so much a part of our public perception and our public policy that we can't possibly make policy that does not have disparate impact on certain populations unless we acknowledge that and try to correct it. So for years and years of manipulation of our history, we have populations who were imported into this country to do labor from Africa, who were not paid for a tremendous amount of work. We have policies that obliterated the life that was once known by the native peoples of this land. We treated certain immigrants differently. And all of that plays into this long shadow of our complicated history. But there was a time, there was an interesting time when there was a group of Europeans, indentured servants, who came over and were working off debts. And there was a moment, a short time in history, and Robin Kelly writes about this, where there might have been some solidarity between indentured servants and indigenous populations and enslaved people. And that's when I think the realization that, oh, we've got to import white supremacy into this new nation. We've got to import the idea that if your skin is white, you have a different reality, that that's the norm, that's the status quo. Because if we don't, and these, and white indigenous servants or white poor people start to convene with and collaborate with enslaved people and indigenous people, we're not going to have a fighting chance. Now, this was not a meeting in some back room where they actually said these things, but this is what the fear of losing power over these populations, power over their bodies, power over their labor, that's what it engendered in the white population. So, you know, white indentured servants was saying, we're told, okay, well, we're going to get rid of that policy, and we're going to give you all, what? Some land and a gun. And then we went down the long road toward emancipation, which ended up in a post-Reconstruction period of violence unlike anything we've ever seen. And that makes me wonder if indeed we focus only on abolishing an institution like prisons, what would be the backlash to that? If we don't deal with the foundational concept of whiteness as normalcy. If we don't deal with the foundational understanding that there are these tropes, these convenient myths about certain populations being lazy or unintelligent or hypersexualized or not to be trusted and dangerous. So dangerous that if they dare to express that they're in distress, if they dare to vocalize in a way that makes me uncomfortable, that they're hungry, so hungry they're ready to die, I have a right to kill them. These are all threads of the seeds of white supremacy. So that's why I focused on that issue. I think it is where we need to start. We need to figure how to reckon with it. Now, of course, one of the responses when we try to focus on white supremacy is people raise their hands and say, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, right? I didn't own any slaves. Maybe my great-great-great-grandfather did, but not. We understand that. And we're not responsible for what our ancestors did, but we are responsible for what we build in the future. So let's figure out a way to reckon with that history, to repair the harm that was done to populations throughout that history, and then to build something together that makes everybody safe. And the rhetoric we use about equality and fairness and justice for all and inalienable rights available to everybody.
Are there any other thoughts about reckoning, since that's one of the main themes in this book? Is there any thoughts anyone can answer?
I mean, I don't see how we justify anything else. Like, I really don't. Like, if we look for a moral basis to not engage in the reckoning that Vivian is talking about, that so many are inviting, I can't actually see how we justify it, how we retain any moral legitimacy to do anything else. Like how we could say a state that has committed genocide, that has enslaved people, that has codified those practices through everything from Jim Crow to redlining to mass incarceration, that state could continue to exist with not just no acknowledgement, but no repair, and still have the legitimacy to lock up a young Black man who stole something? Like, I don't know where that legitimacy comes from in the absence of the kind of reckoning we're talking about. And I think, I also don't think it's as hard as, I mean, it's both the hardest thing and not the hardest thing. You know, when we, in Common Justice, the organization I have the privilege to direct, we do restorative justice processes for serious violence. And in our view, accountability means acknowledging what you've done, acknowledging its impact, expressing genuine remorse, making things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and becoming someone who will never cause that harm ever again. And those things bring about transformations on the individual level all the time. And I don't think those steps are different on a collective level. I think we acknowledge what we've done, we acknowledge its impact, we express remorse, we make things right in ways defined by those harm, and we become a people who won't do it ever again. And I think when we talk about things like reparations, I think people presume it has to be a singular, like totalizing process like in South Africa, which still was truth and reconciliation, but not reparations, right? Which is part of why you see as grave economic inequity now in South Africa as you did during apartheid, right? Even if you see differences in other, key differences in other respects, but you don't see it accrue to how people are able to live. I think there are opportunities for repair all the time, like that there is nowhere we can't engage it. So there's no reason we couldn't do reparations for marijuana policy in New York, and you count everybody who was detained for a couple days when it was supposed to be a violation, and people were charging it like a misdemeanor illegally, right? And you give everybody their $140 a day for that time, right? There's plenty of places where, like, we have receipts, we have numbers, we have names, right? And then there are the structural reinvestments we can call for, right? The things that are about collective, generational harm. Like, all of those things are possible because white supremacy it's not just like one federal policy, right? Like, it's everywhere, it's in everything, which means the possible sites of repair are everywhere and in everything. And I think there is a way in which we think that if we are not ready and clear about how we engage some total process, that like we don't start, or maybe we just like tweet a couple times, but like as though there's nothing in between. And I think those opportunities for repair are continuously available to us. And I think we will build the muscle for what is required to steer into the world that Vivian is describing, like only through practice.
Do you want to go? Or
who's going to go first?
Very quickly, just to add to Danielle's comments and to Vivian, I think often in the political conversation, we're sort of given a choice between talk about disrupting the logic of the system, transformation, ambitious change, and what's actually feasible, what's practical to do today. And I think part of the motivation for the reckoning agenda is to create the conditions, create a public understanding of deep historic harms in order to do change that's of a more fundamental kind. And so this is a practical effort to initiate a process of system transformation. And I think that is really part of the motivation at Square One.
I'd like to make two comments. One about that process, the Square One process, and the other more sort of in this moment. As Bruce described the Square One executive session, we had meetings over 3 years. Each one was 2.5 days, closed door discussions, off the record, with a just remarkable group of people, very diverse points of view. And at that, I think you'll all remember that first session. That first session, and Vivian gets major credit here, this group decided that reckoning was the fundamental sort of topic that the executive session had to take on, because it was so fundamental in the way that has been described here by my panelists to the process of rethinking justice. And that came in the first session. Vivian, I'll never forget, I think you woke up at 4 in the morning after our first session and came in and had written this, I'm not supposed to describe it because it's confidential, but this sort of call to action that was pretty profound. So that discussion really directed much of the work of Square One, the executive session, but also the first Square One roundtable, because at the same time we were holding roundtables around the country in Durham, and we commissioned papers on history, on the, Heather Thompson wrote a paper. We had scholars there to look at the political impact of white supremacy. That became a theme, not just a theme, but sort of the foundational intellectual and political activity required, in just the way that Danielle described, in order to reimagine justice. So the next phase of Square One, this is a promo here, is to take on reckoning seriously. So Vivian and our colleague Suki McMahon have now designed the next set of activities for Square One at the almost executive session format. It's called the National Collaborative for Reckoning and Justice, held the first meeting this past month, and that'll be the next 3-year project. At the same time, the Square One project at Columbia has received funding from the MacArthur Foundation to hold a Square One process in Oklahoma on reckoning. So this is the state with one of the highest incarceration rates. This is the state that has a bloody history in terms of the Trail of Tears and the indigenous population in that state. It is the state of Tulsa. So Oklahoma has come together in this really interesting way to start reckoning with that history. Go figure. And in Multnomah County, another one of our colleagues, Abby Stamp, you saw her on the video, is going to do the same thing in her county. So this is not an impossible idea. This is not just a sort of something out there. This is actionable. Those two jurisdictions are thinking about it seriously, but it's actionable anywhere if you are serious about getting beyond where we are today. This is the precondition. The statement about the moment is, just to remember that we are in an era where CRT is being attacked. You can't teach in many states the history of our country to students. Faculty members are being told not to engage in the curricular activity that comes with, in my view, academic freedom. That we have a pushback of I was going to say unprecedented. That's not right when you talk about after Reconstruction, but this is new in the sense that it's old, but it's very real. So this activity of reckoning is, in part, I think, a obligation of citizenship for all of us, is to push back in our field, in the criminal justice field, against those forces that are now trying to require us not to mention the 1619 Project. Go figure what's going on in this country. So reckoning is not just a criminal justice imperative. It's really an imperative, I think, for anybody who cares about our aspirations for multiracial democracy.
Absolutely. So back to the book in general. There's a lot of books about criminal justice. Can you tell me what makes Parsimony different? Anyone?
Well, I think the diversity of the contributors, right, and the various styles that they bring, the various histories they bring. Several contributors, including myself, have spent time in the criminal justice system as guests of the state. And I don't know I don't know that there's another process other than the executive session and the production of the book Parsimony that has been inclusive in that way, where people from many different disciplines, many different specialties are able to put forth a vision that is both specific and broad in the way that it calls us to imagine the big things we think we can't tackle, but also get down to business and changing the things that we can change as soon as we possibly can. I mean, Jeremy reminded me that one of the things I wanted to say earlier, one thing we can do is be very conscious. Again, we cannot convert every person who has ideas of white supremacy. That's not going to happen. At the same time, they are also citizens and human beings who have the right to think what they want to think, and when they do something that is interpersonal violence based on their beliefs, they should be treated with human dignity and due process like everybody else. And until we have that attitude, we're kind of replicating the same punishment model that we're trying to eliminate. So these are the things I think that make this book different. These ideas of, let's do what we say. If we want to not make punishment the foundation for how we respond to harm, then let's give that to even the people we don't agree with.
Anyone else want to give that a go?
So there are a lot of books about criminal justice, which is a good thing for our work. I think one of the attributes of this particular book is that it is, so the second part of the title is Parsimony, and other radical ideas about justice. It is radical in the sense that it's going back to basics. Many of the books that are in our world that get a lot of attention, as they should, are critiques, deep critiques, searching critiques of the way the world is. This book, we hope, does that. We all sort of have our moments of shaking our fist at the universe and saying, look how awful it is what we've done in this country, but also is an effort to plant some seeds. And Darrell said in another context, in another session we were on, he said, it's not as though you can look around the world and see a lot of seedlings of parsimony or dignity, but that's what we need to plant. And this book has lots of ideas about what those seeds might look like and how in our practice and in our conversations we can just say, this is what's important for, it won't be our generation, for the next generation to have a very different vision of what safe and just communities look like. We just have to nurture those seeds. And the chapters that are in the book give you lots of seedlings.
All right, I have a shamelessly selfish question to ask, considering my line of work. The subjects covered in the book, they are hugely relevant to people incarcerated in this nation's prisons and jails. And as we know, there are a lot of publications that are banned in prisons, and this book may very well be banned. So what would you all say to a prison administrator who are looking at this and saying this, and considering whether this book threatens the safety and security of a prison, and they're considering banning it or letting it in? What would you say to that individual?
I would say, there's the book is motivated by transforming the system. Yes, we're trying to engage a deep conversation about the fundamental disruption of mass incarceration to elimination. But the book at its core is about safety and what it takes, the conditions, the connections between people, our relationship to history that can make us safe as a community. And safety is very much a fundamental value of the book, and it's a thread that runs through all of the chapters. But in our view, safety is exactly produced through elevating human dignity, treating people with respect and decency, by building relationships, not destroying them. I think at some level, prison administrators might fear the book because the prisons that they run in the vision of the book are eliminated. But at another level, I think the value of safety, particularly safety born of human connection and dignified and respectful treatment, that shouldn't hold any fear for anyone. And that should be a project around which everyone should be able to rally, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would probably say, do you know that the people who work for you have higher chances of domestic violence, suicide, alcoholism, early death, mental illness? Do you think it might have something to do with the existence of this punitive space, that is not healthy for them either? In fact, it's probably not healthy for you. And what this book promotes is a better world for everyone. It is not a book that wants to start the next war on something. It is a book that wants to begin to heal and create safety for all. That's how I would respond to a corrections administrator.
I would encourage that administrator to, among staff and the incarcerated population, to create a book club and to have discussions.
Yeah.
Listen, I used to be a college president. I'm all about education. Let's talk about this stuff.
Yeah,
right? I mean, this is deep. This is real. What are we afraid of? That's the basic answer to the question. What are you afraid of? But if you embrace what you're afraid of and try to figure out how to sort of make it a learning process, you know, the prisons aren't going to change overnight, but things within those prisons, those relationships within those prisons, can change overnight, and a book might help.
Nice, nice. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you, my esteemed panelists. They did a wonderful job. Wonderful. Hope we all learned a lot from this panel, and I hope you learned a lot for the rest of the day and the rest of the events of this entire summit. Thank you.
So let's give this panel another round of applause. So I can't see you, so I'm going to trust that you're not leaving, because I've got some information for you that you need for the rest of the day. I promise the food will still be there if you stay and listen with me. So I want to thank Congressman Jeffries for being with us this morning. Wasn't that fabulous? And I want to thank Nick and Lawrence again for moderating these thought-provoking panels. And panelists, I think you all have to take a picture if you haven't already done it. They'll tell you back there. So I am back to give you some instructions. And I want to thank, again, the New Press and Square One Project for this incredible panel. And the books are outside. Please take a book. And they might sign them for you if you ask nicely. The New Press has generously donated copies to all of us of this wonderful book, and it is a wonderful book. So we are going to have lunch. I'm going to tell you where it is. You're going to walk to, when you leave the theater, walk all the way down to the right and take the elevators to the second floor, and that's where you'll have lunch and an opportunity to connect with your panelists. The challenge about this wonderful experience we're having today is there are as many people outside talking and engaging as there are inside. So please remember to come back for the afternoon session. And we're going to have multiple sessions in the afternoon beginning at 1:30. That's the start of concurrent panels. and there'll be multiple ones happening at the same time, so please make sure that you consult your program to figure out which ones are where. We will have a 15-minute break after the 1:30 one at 2:45, and then the second round of panels will start again at 3. And I want you to come back tomorrow. It's going to be another exciting day. So tomorrow in the plenary, we're going to have a conversation featuring Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta from the Department of Justice. And then we're going to have a mayoral roundtable hosted by ABC News anchor Lindsay Davis and featuring Mayor Tashara Jones from the city of St. Louis. You've heard about things happening there. Mayor Sharon Weston Broom from the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You heard about what's happening there. Mayor Lumumba from the city of Jackson, Mississippi. See a theme? Lots of things happening in these places. And Mayor Ross Baraka from the city of Newark, New Jersey. And after, I hear somebody from Newark out there. And after and that lets me know you're still there, because we really can't see a thing out there. After the mayoral roundtable, we are fortunate that New York City's mayor, Eric Adams, who is also a John Jay alum, we are welcoming him back to campus, I think, for his first visit since being mayor. So he will speak again in the morning. And then we're going to have some more panels in the afternoon. So we want you to roll up your sleeves, because as they said, the reason why we have hope, as Nick talked about this morning, because we're committed to this work. So go get some sustenance so you can come back committed to more work. Thank you.